Thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to hopefully take some of the fear and worries that we've seen in the last two presentations and talk about a bit of a more hopeful story on using AI to prevent some of these harms. I want to go, just as a point, I think it's very important when we look at this to actually develop a really robust taxonomy at the beginning before we even try to do any preventative work. We need to know what we're actually testing for. And so work like Miron's is very useful in looking at both current cases and also future use cases. These right here are some of the examples that we've observed. I want to flag one thing. There's probably, pieces on there that you've seen either short segments of or read about. One area that I think is growing quickly and we need to watch out for is the use of LLMs to actually code both video games and privacy-focused apps. We've seen a few attempts both by organized crime but also far-right actors to try to create privacy apps where they can have encrypted communication between each other. And as enhanced reasoning improves in some of the later models, this is becoming a lot more feasible for one person or a small team to do. And then I want to talk more broadly about something that came up at GCTF last week, which is, does any of this matter? I mean, we went through a lot of examples from Miron's talk, but how does this practically help groups to actually translate into greater group performance, whether that's planning and executing attacks, recruiting, communicating? There's two things that I think are important to highlight here. Firstly, we're seeing quite significant use in terms of multilingual translation. So groups are now able to reach audiences in 80 or more different languages around the world. Something that's produced in Arabic can be translated into Urdu or Pakistani or any other language you can imagine. Similarly, we're seeing the transnational far right translate English content from the United States or Canada and then spread it in Scandinavia. So this helps them to really broaden the tent and also build connections between groups. The other piece, which is harder to deal with technically, is evading detection. We saw the picture of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. There's a few excellent shots of Zarqawi doing very similar things. There's also, obscuration through very small, low-tech, using emojis or simply obscuring the corner of an image to prevent detection. We have some ways of dealing with this. Fuzzy matching, though, is oftentimes not catching a lot of this content. And so when we look at the actual practical use cases, we're seeing content that's being uploaded and then left for a month, 2 months, 3 months without any kind of content removal, things that in the past would have been taken down within the hour. There's also micro-targeting. I think we all saw what happened in the UK with the Southport riots as well. Even before, the London mayor, Sadiq Khan, was actually deep-faked by far-right groups quite effectively, and you saw groups actually show up in the street on Remembrance Day protesting that around this time last year. Scale and speed. When we were working on ISIS, we used to talk about how they had entire teams. We interviewed one former Daeshi member who had a team of 25 people working on media in Raqqa. Oftentimes now you can reproduce the output of an entire team like that with 1 or 2 or 3 individuals supplanting and really multiplying their outputs. And the last piece is glorification rather than direct belief. I think this is important to touch on. We see a lot of propaganda right now, whether it's image or video, coming from both far-right and Salafi jihadist groups. And I think there's oftentimes a misunderstanding that this content is meant to convince people that ISIS has carried out an attack in Paris, for instance, or far-right extremists have attacked the Capitol again. That's generally not how it's being deployed. It's being deployed to really glorify and incite and maybe inspire lone wolves, as opposed to people looking at this content, which has a distinctive look to it, right? You can tell it's not authentic, but it's really about inspiring rather than direct belief. Okay, now to get into a bit of the more hopeful side of it, I want to go through a few different ways that we're using this. Firstly, we use machine learning to detect and remove TVEC content for a long time now. We've used it really since the beginning of this challenge. And these are not new tools, but the volume of content that we see really necessitates it. So every minute, 65,000 pictures are uploaded to Instagram, 720,000 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube each day. It's impossible to ever have effective content moderation without using AI in that approach. And this is not something that we're new to. We've actually been using machine learning for a long time to do this. Where we're seeing innovation now is we're using AI to accelerate the training of both frontier models and development apps to match the pace of development, which is oftentimes in weeks, not in months now, and actually prevent and protect those systems from exploitation. So similarly, there's 5 broad ways that we're doing this: the detection and removal of TVEC content, downranking of borderline content, which we talked about yesterday, and then also rehabilitation. Colleagues at Mythos Labs and Google Jigsaw and Moonshot are doing really interesting work on using AI to actually off-ramp and then de-radicalize individuals, and they've seen fairly strong success rates, even 70% of formers who are now using some of the Mythos chatbots are actually preferring to use that as opposed to meeting with an individual in person. So we're seeing good uptake. The more central piece to this that I want to talk to you about in depth today is the use of automated red teaming or automated threat modeling and then evaluation of AI systems. This is essentially how we protect safeguards and systems from being exploited by malicious actors, whether that's far-right extremists or Salafi jihadists or even organized crime. So I'm going to take you through a bit of a deep dive on how we actually do that. But I want to point out at the beginning that red teaming is not a panacea for safe AI or safe systems. It will help us to catch a significant number of problems. We talked about, differences between certain models. I mean, Bing is much less tested than OAI and others, and so you see the differences in how they're tested and how these outputs actually manifest. But even if you do extensive red teaming, you will never capture everything. And so while I'm going to go into the importance of how to do this effectively and best practices, I think we need to make sure we're not, imagining red teaming can be done and then, the problem is solved. So I'm going to talk about a report that we're working on for Oxtel right now, which looks at best practices for threat modeling and LLM evaluation. It's also building on some of the work that Ofcom and ASI UK Institute have done. And I think at the first instance, I want to emphasize the importance that human experts are always going to be central to this work. So I think there's oftentimes fear that, automating red teaming or automating content moderation removes the need for humans. We've done this for 10 years, and there's still a need for humans to be there. And that's for 3 simple reasons, right? We need humans to ensure nuance. We need to limit the bias of these systems and our own bias, but also to keep ahead of adversarial shifts. We need to keep looking at how these systems are being exploited and then, keep ahead of it before we see something like the Christchurch incident, which, explodes it onto the front page. And that's the real benefit of red teaming. You can do a lot of this work on the front end. Related to that, there's a significant need for diverse teams working on this. So if you have red teamers who are all of one background or one ethnicity or one language, you're going to miss a lot. Red teamers are essentially there to put themselves in the shoes of an extremist actor and imagine how they're going to use this platform, right? So you can imagine that if you have a really monolithic group of red teamers, you're going to get really monolithic outputs. So as much as possible, expanding the diversity, both linguistic, ethnic, cultural, and even political of the red teamers, you're going to see much more effective red teaming and much more effective safeguards on the back end. The other part of it is iterative testing. So red teaming and threat modeling are great, but we need to do this both pre and post deployment. Oftentimes you'll see companies deploy red teaming before they release a new product. And then after that, even if they make changes to the product later or they tweak the model, they add new data, there's no follow-up. That simply doesn't work. Anytime the product is changed or the model is tweaked or new data is added, you need to continue with iterative testing. The other thing that is oftentimes overlooked is we don't just need to test AI models. So this is the frontier models that we're probably all familiar with and perhaps using, but also the downstream applications. So the majority of people will interact with AI through a downstream application created oftentimes by small startups. And in our experience, startups do not have in-house teams. They don't know the first thing about trust and safety. They're really new to this and they're trying to build and deploy their MVP. They're not worried about safety or red teaming in the slightest. So it creates a real challenge in terms of how to reach those smaller companies that don't have the resources. There are some good examples of when you can do this successfully though. So Snap put out an AI chatbot, and they not only red teams the frontier model is running off of, but also the downstream application. So there is good examples of how we can do this. The second part of it is something that is covered in the EU AI Act, which is the importance of third-party evaluation. It's not sufficient to have AI frontier model developing and then testing its own systems. I mean, it's better than nothing, but ultimately to have real independence and real audit, you need a third-party organization to come in and provide that testing, which doesn't have the biases, doesn't have the pressures of teams working in-house. Similarly, safety by design, I think we're all familiar with this at this point, but really we can't do the same approach with Web 2.0 where we release new products afterwards and then we think about the implications of it. We need engineers and subject matter experts to work together right from the conceptualization and design stage. And then I'm going to talk about some of the practical considerations that we've seen in our own work on this recently. So safety at speed is a huge issue. As I'm sure you're all aware, models are developing within weeks, if not months, of each other. This year, the leading company released 4 models. Next year will probably be 5 or 6. And so oftentimes the timeline to test new products is a matter of weeks. On our last project, the time from RFP to completion was 4.5 weeks. And so the traditional process of putting out a tender, waiting 6 months, asking for funding from either a corporation or a civil society body, and then maybe allocating budget in the following year to test it is not going to work. We have to have very fast and very rapid both supply processes and then also testing processes. That's why we're using hybrid testing. So as much as humans need to be in the room, we also need to automate a lot of this red teaming and have prompt engineering that can speed up this process and allow us to actually deliver safe and effective testing at scale, oftentimes weeks rather than months. But you're always going to have human experts come in at the end and actually clean up and make sure that the models haven't missed anything. And so when we're looking at this, a big part of it is making sure that those employees are safe. We have 10 years of work on content moderators in the traditional social media environment, ensuring that they're both receiving sufficient training, but also sufficient counseling and support while they're in those roles. We have to do this as well with red teamers, and in fact, I think you have to go further because oftentimes it is very emotionally demanding, I would say, to put yourself in the shoes of an extremist actor or an organized crime group. It's not just reacting to it, it's actually putting yourself in those shoes and trying to shift. The last 2 I'm going to talk about is ongoing threat scanning. So we need to keep ahead of the models and keep ahead of the threats rather, and keep training the models with new content that's coming in. So we use a lot of work from Muron and from ISD and from others to actually bring in new threats that are emerging. And this just speaks to the cross-disciplinary and really multi-stakeholder nature of any of this work. You can't do it just with one team or with one set of experts. You really need civil society, you need industry, you need academics, you need everybody in the room. Okay, so a few last concerns here. We have built really strong trust and safety teams at traditional social media companies over the last 10 years. The challenge is that at a lot of these AI frontier models, they're not building on the past teams. They're new people who are working on a much wider range of harms, and we actually have a real challenge in, I think, conveying a lot of the research and best practices that we've developed over the past decade. So really blending the new teams that we see at these frontier models who are working on much broader harms with the experience that we've developed, I think is going to be critical to actually doing this in a safe and effective way. There's also existing legislation and regulation for testing and red teaming of AI models, but it doesn't require at this stage, the EU AI Act, the TCO, DSA, and the OSA, none of them require independent third-party testing, which is critical to this, but it's not legally enshrined at this point, so there's a legislative hurdle as well. We've got some resources here. If anybody is doing this or is interested in contributing to it, if they have a CSO or a community group that has done some work on extremism, I'd love to chat with you and see how we can help. Some further reading. And lastly, I want to leave us with a few broad thoughts. I think AI is really a double-edged sword, right? So it can be used both to create a lot of harms, which we saw at the beginning, but it can also be used to safeguard and ensure that these systems are putting out, helpful, useful, safe content that actually improves our quality of life. But to do that, there's going to be a time lag between when these new models are released and when we get regulatory and legislative compliance up to speed to do it. So it's really in this time lag where we need to work on safeguards, red teaming, back-end engineering, and make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. Thanks very much.